Hi guys, and welcome back to another English with Dry. Today we are going to take a look at J.B. Priestley's play An Inspector Calls. Specifically, we are going to look at the inspector and his contrasting character presentation with Arthur Birling. In order to do this, we are going to take a look at two of their speeches from opposite ends of the play and see exactly how the two characters are presented as being polar opposites of the other. The reason Priestley does this is in order to show the main differences between their worldviews, specifically capitalism from Arthur Birling and socialism from the inspector. In Act 1, Birling gives yet another speech. On this occasion, it is directed towards Eric and Gerald. It is all about his worldview and how he believes the world should run. He is attempting to give them some advice on how they should live in order to be successful, such as he. He begins with the somewhat ironic statement, "I don't want to lecture you two young fellows again." This is amusing to the audience because, of course, it's clear by now that he loves nothing more than lecturing the people around him. Now, this is sort of exactly emblematic of people like Birling because their first instinct is always to tell people how they should live rather than converse with them. The use of the verb lecture is fitting because it kind of connotes this idea that he is telling them what he thinks whilst also giving them no opportunity to offer their own opinion back towards him. It's also interesting that he calls them young fellows because this is exactly the sort of person he wishes to tell his opinions at rather than listen to. It shows that he wants to give his patriarchal and elitist opinions and that he wants the younger generation to carry them on. The greatest fear of people like Birling in 1912 was that their ideologies would not pass on to the next generation and that their way of life would be threatened, particularly the increasingly socialist ideas that were starting to spread all over Europe and in England were worries to them, and that is why he feels the need to lecture them. As he continues, he describes how a man has to make his own way. Now, what's notable here, specifically in the language, is the repeated use of first person and also possessive pronouns. He talks in the I form very frequently, and also describes how people have to do things their own way and look after himself. This shows his committed capitalist beliefs, the idea that nobody else matters as much as the individual, and that by only seeing to themselves, they can be successful. It reinforces his selfishness, in short. Finally, he describes how his fundamental belief, which is obviously diametrically opposed to the inspector, is that we should only take responsibility for ourselves and our immediate family. He does not view it as his responsibility to look after anyone else, and that because he has achieved personal success, he doesn't have responsibility to share that with anyone who has been less successful and less fortunate than he. As his speech continues, he describes the opposite viewpoint to him as being used by cranks. Now, a crank is a pejorative term, which means an insulting term, which is used to describe people's beliefs that the majority others think is false. He's using it to refer to socialists, which was an increasing viewpoint, as we've said, in Britain at this time and all over Europe. There had already been, of course, sort of socialist uprisings in countries like Russia, and also, famously, the French Revolution was all about more socialist ideals rather than old-fashioned ones that people like Birling espouse. The connotations of crank also suggest that someone is unable to admit they're wrong about things. And again, this is quite ironic because, of course, all of these things actually apply to Birling himself. His use of imagery in this speech is worth noting because he uses the simile comparing society to bees in a hive, which also further shows his ignorance. He uses it to attempt to show that people who have socialist beliefs think working together is a good thing and that they are foolish for this. Because, in his opinion, beehives are just a mess, a mass of buzzing without anything being done. However, again, he's wrong, further showing his ignorance, and that his analogy is flawed because actually beehives are deeply structured and also largely consist of all parts being equal and working together to achieve success. He describes community as being nonsense, Now this shows a real level of scorn from Arthur Birling. It shows in the strongest terms that he's against this socialist ideology, and he believes that it literally does not make sense to show care for anyone other than yourself and your immediate family. As he's building to his crescendo, we hear the sharp ring of a doorbell. Now this stage direction, along with the stage direction of the telephone used later on, are often used in the play to interrupt Birling when he's making a point that is incorrect or shows his arrogance. Priestley uses this stage direction as a means of suggesting that the world itself is going to shortly interrupt people like Birling, and that it's grown tired of hearing views like his. Now we're going to contrast this speech with the final one the inspector gives in Act 3. This is where he delivers his verdict on what the Birling family and Gerald have done, and then leaves them for good. His opinion is presented as immediately different to Birling's, as he shows an awareness of the lives of millions and millions and millions of others all around us. The inspector really is Priestley's mouthpiece in the play, and therefore asserts all of his socialist opinions, and this really sums up how Priestley viewed the world himself. He talks of both Eva Smiths and John Smiths that are still left with us. Now, the naming of the two names chosen here are deeply significant. Eva, of course, is significant as it implies how she represents every person on the planet, and of course the name Eva stems from Eve, and so therefore it's almost as if she is the kind of mother of humanity. She is the kind of beginning point at the line of everyone else in the world. Smith, of course, was the most common English last name, and John was a very common man's name. And so therefore, the inspector is indicating to us his point that everyone is affected, just like Eva Smith is. They stand as representations of all of us. He continues to reinforce Priestley's direct message to the wealthy Birlings and people like them when he says that we, or rather they, can make a difference. They have the ability to give them happiness or make them suffer. And it's this power that he thinks is something that is a great privilege but also great responsibility. For he says that all of our lives are intertwined. Now this word is indicative of his unshakable belief that we are connected and that we cannot act without affecting those around us. Society, he imagines, has an unbreakable bond, and this is exactly what he thinks in terms of how we should be able to see the impact of our own behaviour on others and change and do things accordingly. Finally, he notes that we don't live alone and that we are members of one body. Now this is his central metaphor for society, and it compares it to the human body. This implies that just as the body relies on every organ and molecule to be healthy and to function properly, a successful society needs all of its citizens also to be well. This clear implication is that, just as was the case in Britain, which was starting to move towards revolution before World War I took hold, huge numbers of people are barely surviving. This means that society will not be successful and will not flourish. We are responsible for each other is the most clear admission that he disagrees with Birling. It's overwhelmingly his message that everyone in Britain take a greater responsibility for the lives of everyone else. You'll notice that he uses collective pronouns we and us repeatedly, and again this marks his differing point of view. He's aware of the other people around him, and he is aware of what we must do to make their lives better. This really epitomises the difference between the two of them. He finally warns that if people do not learn this message, they will soon be taught it in fire and blood and anguish. Now, of course, this is interesting because World War I soon happened after 1912. It began in 1914. And so literally he is referring to this war. The inspector suggests that the Great War, with its pain and suffering on a never-before-seen level, was this punishment. It was a punishment for British society, for its elitism, for its lack of social mobility, and the fact that it refused to embrace more of a social liberalism. Alternatively, we could interpret that the punishment will literally be hell itself, and which implies that people like Birling will be punished in the afterlife for choosing to live life in such a selfish and thoughtless way. Either way, it is very much a threat that we must learn from these mistakes. And so we have a brief summary here in terms of contrast between the two of them. One, on a linguistic level, Birling repeatedly uses singular pronouns, I, and this encapsulates his selfish point of view, versus the inspector, who always uses we and us, which highlights his awareness of those around him. 2. Birling's imagery shows both his ignorance and his belief that working together will get society nowhere, from the bees in the hive simile. The inspector, however, uses a metaphor that shows that we cannot function unless we all work together with members of one body. 3. Birling speaks disparagingly and insultingly of people who disagree with him. Cranks is what he calls them, and he describes their opinions as nonsense. Whereas the inspector's message is calm and considered, he talks instead of the chance that we all have to improve the lives of others. And finally, Birling's speech is cut off. He's interrupted by the doorbell. Now that shows Priestley believed his opinion should be stopped and not given the chance to be heard anymore by the wider world. The inspector, however, is allowed to finish, give his warning uninterrupted, and then dramatically leave. I hope you found this video helpful. Please like and subscribe and stay tuned for more videos.